When Caleb, our third child, had just turned 1, my parents came for a week-long visit, and we were really thankful for the help. Surviving that first year with 3 little ones was hard enough, but I was also working hard from moving from Billerica to Arlington, had just gone through a major season of nonstop ministry, and was finishing up a thesis for another master's degree. Needless to say, I was either not home or pretty checked out when I was. So those extra hands to manage all the functional challenges were much needed. But by the end of the week, my parents had decided to offer more help than I was really interested in receiving. Their main concern wasn't with just keeping our kids fed, clothed, and entertained, but focused more so on my parenting, or lack thereof, and the behavioral issues that were developing in my kids. Abby, who was 5, was defining herself as a stubborn negotiator who constantly argued and often wore us down anytime we tried to get her to do anything. Lydia, who was 3, had perfected her screaming skills so that even the slightest provocation, ranging from having a sibling take a toy to being asked to clean up a mess, would result in ear-piercing screams and crying. Caleb had just learned to walk and was quickly establishing his role as the wrecker, as our girls love to call him. His passions in life were to kick, hit, or throw stuff or people, and he was adept at all 3. My tactic in handling all this chaos? Tune it out by checking email or playing games on my iPhone, occasionally yelling from the couch when they got especially annoying to me. Pretty effective parenting, right? The sad thing was, my master's thesis that was a part of my rationalization that I was too tired to do more was all about the Milestone curriculum we had just started that has the goal of raising a Jesus-loving generation. I'd even just added the idea for this milestone, the disciple, to help families at our church catch the vision for discipling their kids. But at the end of her visit, my mom told me that I barely even took the time to look my kids in the eye because I was moving too fast and then vegging out too much. Look into their eyes, she said. Initially, I was angry that my mom didn't understand how hectic my life was and how I shouldn't have to feel guilty at home for not having energy when I was pouring out so much everywhere else. But I had to admit, I couldn't really remember the last time I had actually looked into my kids' eyes. So after getting past the initial indignation, I decided to start focusing more on my role as a parent. It meant immediate boundaries around using the iPhone and computer, basically setting aside both from the time I got home until the kids were in bed. But in many ways, that was the easy part, because looking in my kids' eyes opened up my eyes to a whole world of parenting that I had neglected. Now, before I explain some things that I saw and eventually learned, I'd love for you all to pause right now and imagine looking into your child's eyes. The eyes are like a pathway to seeing our kids' hearts and all of what makes them who they are. So consider these 2 questions. You may even want to pause the video to reflect or write down a few thoughts. What do you see as the God-given giftings and blessings your child has to offer this world? Consider how they make you smile, the passions they express, and the possible ways that God might use them to build His kingdom. And number 2, what do you see as the current obstacles that might thwart God's best for your children? What are the sins that seem to trip them up, and how could Satan attack their weakness to distract them from honoring God? Maybe you're better than me at slowing down to reflect on what God might be doing in your child. But I know for many of us, parenting can so often just be focused on surviving, and in that survival mode, the only goal we end up having is really just behavior modification. Behavior modification is a science that was developed in the early 1900s, first utilizing dogs. Ivan Pavlov discovered that he could trigger salivation by associating a bell with a steak. Eventually, he could ring the bell and get salivation even without the steak. By the 1950s, behavior modification had made a complete shift from dogs to become the primary form of parenting. This would be all well and good if our kids were in fact dogs, but they're not. Our children have souls that make them spiritual beings, so simply developing tools for changing their external behaviors often leads to internal turmoil as it fails to address their hearts. That's why this milestone is called the disciple and not the discipline. A disciple is literally one who is attached to another. Jesus chose 12 disciples who spent 3 years being attached to Him. And during that time, they did many stupid external things, and one even turned completely against him. But in the end, Jesus completely captured 11 of their hearts so powerfully that even when he left, they went on to tell the world all about how Jesus had changed their lives. And discipling our kids in ways that lead them toward that type of relationship with Christ is what I'd like to talk about in this seminar. So where do we start? Well, in many ways, we already started with Milestone 2, the blessing, where we talked about giving the gift of unconditional love and acceptance to our kids. Two of our mentors, Paul and Virginia Friesen, who have been ministering to parents for decades, suggest that this is the first goal of parenting, to establish a deep sense of unconditional love and safety in our homes. One parenting book I appreciated, Parenting is Heart Work, suggests 11 ways to build these types of relationships with our kids. Here are the quick suggestions, and you can download fuller explanations in the resource section. As I read through these, I found them to be really helpful summaries of things I hadn't done nearly enough prior to my mom's challenge. But after my mom's challenge, I started to prioritize and enjoy many of them. We moved closer to church to make my commute better. I created better boundaries around technology. I set aside time for individual dates with the kids, along with special family times, and we even bought a trampoline that has provided hours of fun together. Family life improved dramatically, and I started delighting in my kids more than ever, minus those moments. Once my kids saw what a cool and wise dad I could be, why didn't they just jump at the chance to come right away when called, or delight in sharing their toys like I taught them, or make requests that aren't thoroughly doused in whininess? Apparently, there was something I was missing. And I guess that's why the Friesens suggest a second goal of parenting, equally as important as number one. Goal 2 is teaching our children how to submit to, respect, and honor authority in their lives. Now, to be honest, for the first 5 years of parenting, I think I totally missed the point of this second goal. At times I felt like it sounded almost arrogant. I mean, who am I to demand obedience and honor? I really just wanted my kids to like me. The whole authority thing seemed harsh. But then I had other early stages of parenting where I was all about ruling over my house with an iron fist, wanting my kids to get in line and give me the respect I deserved as their father. I find that most parents tend to lean one way or the other, but both fall short of what this goal really is meant to accomplish. Thankfully, Ephesians 6 really helped me pull it together. Paul writes, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord." Okay, so let's work backwards so I can show you how this passage helped me catch a vision for what teaching authority and respect is all about. First, parents are called to train and instruct their children to follow God. Of all the many, many dreams and goals we might have for our children, teaching them to follow God is our number one priority. Why? Because number two, obedience to God's authority leads to life and freedom and joy. We all want life to go well for our children, and despite the many other ways the world will suggest to make this happen, surrendering to God and receiving His forgiveness is the way to get there. So how does God want to teach them to follow and obey Him? Well, number three, by first learning to follow and obey us. God has created the parent-child relationship as a way of training the next generation to understand His ultimate authority in their life. So all this means that, number 4, I teach my kids to respect and honor authority, not to make them more likable or to get them to do my bidding for me, but to cultivate hearts that are ready to obey and trust God and the joy-filled path to life that He offers. To simply love our kids without teaching them obedience and respect for authority misses a huge part of their hearts. God wants their hearts, but sin will always fight in for control. So He's created this structure where we as parents are given the responsibilities of creating a safe, loving environment where we can teach them to respect and obey our authority to prepare their hearts to embrace His loving leadership in their lives. So we need a plan for disciple making that captures our kids' hearts in a way that teaches them to respect authority. But that hesitation to just demand respect is still worth paying attention to. If I get really honest about what drives my parenting, it often comes down to my own past baggage, present stressors, and future angst. And as a result, I use my inherent power as their parent to force my kids to do what I want, when I want, and how I want it done to satisfy my needs and neuroses. And I've talked enough to parents to know that I'm not alone. So as we start to develop our disciple-making plan, we have to be aware of the potential we have in ourselves to grab authority in a way that causes us to exercise power over our children instead of exercising power over ourselves. When discussing this idea with my wife, Heather, she immediately thought of the frustrations of getting our kids to church on Sundays when I'm not around to help. She legitimately has a lot going on with getting ready to lead a kids' rock group, trying to make the kids look presentable, and hoping to get some breakfast too if possible. But the kids have none of this agenda for themselves. So when she's hustling them out the door and Lydia is taking forever to get her shoes on, Heather can get super frustrated. She has no interest in hearing why Lydia is being slower than Moses because she needs to go teach about Moses. And after some harsh words, Lydia, our most sensitive child, is in tears, and Heather's anxiety elevates even higher, tempting her to want to crush Lydia's tiny spirit into submission. No wonder so many kids of church leaders end up hating church. But instead, Heather has to use her power to let go of her desire to be on time and care for Lydia's heart. And in the future, she may need to use her power to simply get up earlier so she has more time to handle little hearts in the midst of getting ready. Jesus is an incredible model for this. Jesus came to earth with ultimate power and authority to do whatever he wanted. But instead of using his power to crush his wayward children, he used his power to discipline himself so that he could be a humble vessel of grace, truth, and love. So putting it simply for us, disciplers need to be disciples, and discipliners need to learn a ton of discipline for themselves if they're going to administer the grace, truth, and love God has entrusted us with. We could spend a lot of time talking through the challenges we face in being better disciples of ourselves. But for now, let me offer 4 discipling don'ts that I think can help set a good foundation. Number 1, disciplers don't lie. This may seem obvious, but lying is so common in our culture that we may not even realize how we do it. A pastor I once knew told me how he had realized that preschoolers are so afraid of being left alone that you can get them to do anything if you tell them that you're going to leave them somewhere. I think it was after having 3 kids that getting anywhere became such a challenge that I decided using this ploy was necessary. Thankfully, in preparing for this seminar, I was convicted by another High Rock parent that this is totally undermining my credibility as a discipler. I won't really leave them, and far more important than getting them to come quickly is them knowing that the man who is discipling them tells the truth. It's easy to lie to a child and get them to do what you want. The consequences down the road can be so severe when our kids don't know if they can trust us, or worse, they wonder whether they can trust God because they don't have a paradigm in place for a trustworthy authority in their life. Number 2, disciplers don't put down, they build up. Not swearing or emotionally abusing our kids is something I hope we can all agree on, though I know it can be a huge challenge at times. But the thing I'd like to make a case for briefly is to get rid of sarcasm. At its worst, sarcasm is a way to vent our anger or frustration about a situation through veiled, biting comments that are only permissible because we're just kidding. But even when it is a simple joking comment, I think sarcasm wastes the precious few words that we have to offer our kids. I'm sure I'll be sarcastic along the way, and I certainly want my kids to be able to take a joke. But more importantly, I want them to be built up in Christ. Using my words toward that purpose is my ultimate goal. And a close relative of sarcasm is name-calling or labeling. Comments like, "This is our slow child," or "Why are you being so dumb?" or "Sally is shy." It can really define a child's identity in ways that we never intended. So be intentional and careful about using words that speaks Christ's love and truth to our children. Number 3, disciplers don't discipline in anger. You can be angry and your kids can even know that you're angry. There are plenty of times our kids will push our buttons to the point that we feel so angry that we want to scream, yell, or even hit. Take a break. Parents need timeouts too. It's perfectly legitimate and even helpful modeling to your child that you feel so angry that you need to take a break to calm down and to delay discipline until you return. Then, as an alternative to being big and scary and angry, go slow, get low, and listen. This practice is one taught by Jim and Lynn Jackson in their Discipline That Connects course, and I find it to be an excellent practice that slows us down when we're wanting to explode. humbles us as we get physically low down to their level where we can connect better, and allows us to listen instead of lecture, which is something we'll talk about more later. And number 4, disciplers don't overuse media. This is a whole seminar in itself, but when I first started teaching this seminar, I made one passing comment about not using TV too much, and Mom told me that was her main takeaway. And when I gave this seminar at our kids' preschool, parents came up afterwards and media limits were their main question. So a few thoughts. First, I want to say that we're very thankful for media and use it strategically in 2 ways. One, we have great Bible videos and we love shows like Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood as opportunities for teaching our kids good truth. Little House on the Prairie has become a family favorite as we'll often stop in the middle of episodes to talk about the great lessons on loving others that come up. 2, there are times when we just need a nap or our kids need a break, and a show or an iPhone game can really help keep us all sane. That being said, kids learn and grow best through play and live interactions. So we work hard to limit media consumption. At times we've been very organized about it, giving each child 6 30-minute tokens per week to use on media. That seemed to be effective even when our youngest was 3 years old, as long as we helped him. We don't always monitor it quite so precisely, but overall, our kids know that media is something that they have to ask for and only get for limited periods. The quantity goes up a bit in the winter and becomes less in the spring, summer, and fall when they can be out playing more. The bottom line, though, is we want something more than just the new status quo where families use electronic babysitters at every turn and even watch TV during dinner instead of learning to engage with one another. And looking ahead to the teenage years, when social media, video games, pornography all come into play, be wise now about creating limits on the quantity and quality of media consumption as you train your kids to interact well with others and not just veg out. So those are some discipling don'ts, all of which Heather and I have failed at many times, but try to keep in check so that we can focus in on the positive ways we want to disciple our kids. And that gets us to my favorite aspect of putting together this whole seminar. Now that we've laid the foundation for what it means to be disciples ourselves, we can next turn our attention to what I call disciple making beyond commands, correction, and consequences. This is the practical stuff about disciplining your children that you've probably been waiting for. So I'll give you some of it now to get you started, and the rest of it in part 2. But lest you think this all came together smoothly and naturally for me, let me share a story. To this day, our oldest daughter, Abby, is not a morning person. But when she was in kindergarten, things were particularly rough. Heather started out trying to get her up each day, but eventually became so frustrated she called in reinforcements. I was right in the midst of prepping this seminar, and I was confident in my newfound insights that would solve things quickly. I went in ready for battle that first morning, laying out clear commands and consequences, which involved getting a short back rub, having me count to 10, and then losing her favorite stuffed animal if she didn't get up immediately. The system worked well for a few weeks, and I started gloating to Heather about my awesome discipline skills. But then all of a sudden, on the Thursday before I first gave this seminar back in 2012, despite going to bed at a good time and not being sick beyond maybe a little cold, Abby was just too tired to get out of bed. But I was ready for the challenge. She lost her stuffed animal, which got her out of bed eventually, but then she threw her shirt at me and refused to pick it up. So her stuffed animal's gone until after school now. Nothing. Okay, she lost 5 minutes after school on the playground. Still nothing. Fine, I'm leaving until you are ready to obey me and pick up your shirt and finish getting dressed. Came back a few minutes later, and nothing. I finally got her to pick up her shirt and get dressed, telling her that now she was likely to miss some of school, which was something she actually did like, but then at breakfast she was still being super slow, and I'd had enough. I threw up my hands in exasperation and told Heather I couldn't think of any more consequences to try. Heather stepped in, graciously not gloating about my failure, and helped Abby through breakfast and got her ready to leave, though there was still plenty of tension and resistance. I then walked her to school, trying to turn things around, but still felt pretty frustrated. We got to school, and she decided she didn't want to go in. Her teacher came out to help, and Abby started to head inside, but then remembered she had forgotten a book she wanted to bring to show her class. Her teacher told her she could bring it tomorrow, but Abby was now bawling uncontrollably, and as she walked into school, I was ready to pull my hair out. Needless to say, I had a lot to learn about disciplining and discipling my daughter. And maybe you feel similarly. You've tried everything you can, but you just don't seem to be getting through the way you'd like to. Thankfully, there's a pretty good ending to that story that you'll hear in part 2. But let's break it down to see where I went wrong. We'll start with the first C, commands. To be honest, I use commands for the alliterative connection in this section, but I do think that some of us can elevate many of our rules to the level of commandments that must be enforced at all costs. But the 10 commandments are all set. So let's not become the Pharisees who had 613 laws that they elevated to commandments and constantly tried to force people to keep. In my situation with Abby, I had created all sorts of commandments with regard to our morning routine, and I think it was overwhelming both of us. So here's 5 tips for making rules that I found really helpful in laying the groundwork for teaching honor and respect. Number 1, keep the rules simple, 3 to 5 max. And if possible, when they're younger, use pictures or hand motions for them. For years, visitors to our house would have seen the Dietz Family Rules poster, decorated masterfully by our 3 artists, hanging prominently by our kitchen table. Each is based on a scripture verse that we had the kids memorize and is spelled out with some specific examples. Here are 3 rules, and I'll put them in the resources so you can have them if you'd like. Number 1, obey your parents and your teachers, babysitters, grandparents, etc. It's based on Colossians 3:20. Some examples of that are no means no and come means come. Answer questions right away, obey first, and then we talk about it. We're happy to talk through things with our kids, but we want them to learn obedience first rather than arguing and complaining as the go-to response, which seems to be the natural inclination for most kids. Number 2, build others up with your words, based on Ephesians 4:29. We think our usage of words is so huge that we try hard to avoid whining, screaming, complaining, or mean words. And we continue to teach about waiting your turn to talk, teaching them to use excuse me and then wait. Number 3, be kind to one another, based on Ephesians 4:32. That involves sharing, because everything belongs to Jesus, and no hitting. We've acted out skits, played games, decorated lots of posters over the years, and talked them through many times explaining how valuable they are to making our home a place that everyone can enjoy. And in case you're wondering, yes, our kids still fail to follow all of them, so we have yet to work ourselves out of a job. But that points to why tip number 2 is so important. Rules without relationship lead to rebellion. This goes back to the first goal of parenting, where we lay down the groundwork for all of our rules by establishing a safe, loving environment. But let me drive home that point further by saying that if you have to choose between enforcing a rule and building the relationship comes first. I don't believe the 2 are mutually exclusive at all. We'll talk more about how we can actually build deeper connections relationally through our rules. But for those of us who are prone toward making rule keeper the be-all and end-all of our parenting, know that rebellion is likely right around the corner. And number 3, don't discipline for childish behavior. In preschool, Lydia got something on her clothes at every meal and came home with dirt all over her pants most days. She's just clumsy. There's no sin involved. Spilled milk, a broken glass, even dropping your phone or damaging your home or car in some way. These can really upset us, and my favorite rationale for being mad is it's a stewardship issue. But none of these are generally expressions of sin. Some training might be helpful, but kids are messy, so just accept it and don't damage your relationship over mere material damage to something else. Learn to steward your relationship over your stuff. Number 4, clarity or immunity. Kids are easily confused, and if we're honest, we might not always be the greatest at spelling things out in a way that they can grab onto. So if the rule or request wasn't abundantly clear, you own that. Give the benefit of the doubt. Offer no discipline and help make the rule clear for the future. And number 5, the best no's are all about the yeses. No is an important word that our kids need to learn to obey. But the best no's are always focused on something else we want our kids to be able to enjoy. No, don't touch that hot stove because, yes, I want you to have your hands free to enjoy much more pleasant things. But it's far too easy for us to just get so consumed by all the no's that we lose sight of the love we want to convey through them. So think carefully about why you're saying no and the yes that might be behind it. And if you can rearrange things to get to a yes without even having to say no, that's even better. One family kept a glass lamp in their 2-year-old's room right where she could reach it, so they constantly had to keep on her, telling her no every time she went near it. Instead, they could have just moved the lamp. But when a no is needed, stick with it. Avoid idle threats, otherwise they'll quickly learn to nag and negotiate until you say yes, and those aren't the yeses that disciple them well at all. And remember, their no's mean no too. If they ask you to stop tickling or want their own space in ways that are reasonable and appropriate, we need to honor that to help them establish their own personal boundaries. And that should do it. If you employ those 5 tips for rulemaking, you'll have perfect kids in no time. But just in case that doesn't happen, well, maybe you should check out part 2 of The Disciple. In the next portion of the seminar, we'll seek to move beyond correction and consequences and look how to communicate in heart-connecting ways and respond with disciple-making strategies when kids don't follow the rules and need more training. But to help you reflect on what we've talked about so far, I'll leave you with some questions to prayerfully consider on your own, with your spouse, or with a friend. My hope is that through what we've already discussed and what will be covered in part 2, you'll develop a parenting plan that draws you and your children closer to Christ and one another as we partner together to raise a Jesus-loving generation.